Jeff,
Hello, Betsy. You digging out of a little snow?
we have uh, we have a lot of snow. Yeah.
Wow. Hi, I'm Jeff Goodell, contributing editor at Rolling Stone. I just talked with Pulitzer Prize winning author Elizabeth Kolbert about coral sex, why there's no quick solutions for the climate crisis, and her new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. Congratulations on your book. I have a copy of it here. This book is really interesting on many levels, but I want to start with the sort of broadest level, which is one of my pet peeves when I talk to people about climate change, is this notion that we're going to fix the climate. What do we have to do to fix the climate? And you kind of take that idea on directly in this book about the implications and consequences of fixing the climate. Can you talk just a little bit about that and the sort of big sense of what it means to fix the climate?
First, the good news: we are having a conversation about climate change and what to do to, what those in the climate change world would say, I think, is mitigate climate change. Whenever someone says, we're going to solve climate change, we're going to fix the climate, your ears should definitely, perk up, prick up, because better than anyone, climate change is like a super tanker. You are pushing a humongous system, a system the size of planet Earth, in one direction. And you don't get to just stop that when you decide you don't like it. So one of the messages that I think hasn't really gotten out yet is that carbon dioxide is not like, it's not like particulate matter where you can say, okay, if we stopped emitting that, it would settle to the earth, it would dissipate. That problem could be solved in fairly short order if we took dramatic steps. If we reduced our emissions by half tomorrow, which is a very tall order, obviously not going to happen, we would still continue to push the climate. We would just be doing it more slowly. We would end up in exactly the same place. It would just take a little bit longer to get there. And even if we reduced our emissions to zero, we would still see warming. Once again, it's somewhat debated for exactly how long, but presumably on a decadal level.
You talk about how our attempts to fix things, to control things, to make things better, can end up backfiring. And you go through the book. In your book, you talk about several examples of that, from the problem of Asian carp infestation in the Great Lakes, to genetic engineering, to solar geoengineering, the climate. You open the book with the Asian carp example, which I think is sort of kind of funny and strange and great, emblematic of what you're talking about. Describe what the problem with Asian carp is and why you started the book with that.
The first chapter is sort of a metaphor that opens the book, and it starts with the Chicago River, which bisects the city of Chicago, as Chicagoans know, and for most of geological history flowed east into Lake Michigan. And Chicago grew up along the Chicago River and dumped all of its waste into the Chicago River, dumped all of its sewage, as the stockyards grew, dumped all of its animal waste. And it was said that the river was so thick with filth that a chicken could walk across it without getting her feet wet. And this was, not just disgusting, obviously, but it had very serious public health implications because Chicago drinks from Lake Michigan. So this filth was all going into Lake Michigan. Chicago was drinking from Lake Michigan, and you're getting constant outbreaks of waterborne disease. So around the turn of the 20th century, the leaders of the city of Chicago decided, something's got to be done about this. And what they decided to do was this massive construction project that reversed the flow of the Chicago River. It was one of the most massive construction projects of its day. You have written about that too. And so now the Chicago River flows west into the Mississippi drainage basin. And that solved one problem. There was a facetious headline when the canal that solved the problem, this huge construction project was a huge canal. When it was finally opened, the New York Times had a facetious headline that said something like, "Water in the Chicago River resembles liquid again," or something like that. So it solved one problem, But in the process, which no one seems to have been thinking about, it connected these two huge drainage basins, the Great Lakes Drainage Basin and the Mississippi Drainage Basin. And the effects of that became apparent over the course of the 20th century as both the Great Lakes and the Mississippi became these highly invaded water systems. So tons of invasive species wreaking havoc in both systems and now able to cross from one to the other. And Asian carp, which are really four species, so it sounds like one species, there's really four species that were imported largely, and we can talk about this, to do biocontrol, to try to control for certain pollutants that we didn't like without using chemicals. They had the effect of getting out of control, have completely taken over the Mississippi system, many of its tributaries as well. They make up, in some parts of the river system, like 90% of the biomass now. So it's a huge impact. And people in the Great Lakes really don't want them in the Great Lakes. So they're trying to think of ways to keep them out of the Great Lakes, even though these systems are connected. And what they've come up with so far is electrifying parts of this river, basically. So you go down the Chicago River, you go into what's called the Sanitary and Ship Canal, and eventually you reach a part of the river that's so electrified that if you were to jump in, you would probably die.
Even hearing you describe this, and I felt it also reading it, your book reads a little bit like a kind of darkly comic Greek tragedy of humans having the hubris to think that they can manipulate things in ways, and all of these kinds of what are on some level effective, on other levels completely harebrained schemes, like reversing the flow of the river, then putting all these electric barriers up that in theory electrocute the fish, but also if you fall in the water, electrocute you. You capture this larger hubris of these attempts to fix things. And this is something that's, as you pointed out, has been deeply a part of environmentalism and climate action for a long time. In fact, you pointed out, I did not know that Silent Spring, the great book about DDT and pesticides that kicked off the environmental movement in the late 50s and early 60s, was first called The Control of Nature.
Yeah, that was a working title. It was, Rachel Carson didn't really care for it, but that was the working title that it was given. Yeah, isn't that interesting?
So what inspired you, though, to kind of write about this? I mean, a lot of the conversation about climate right now is about, how we need to make emissions cuts or how we need to kind of adapt. But you've taken it to a kind of another level, a kind of meta level of talking really about how a lot of these sort of solutions that are coming down the road are so problematic. What was the genesis for this?
I went a few years ago to Hawaii to do some reporting and visited a project that had been nicknamed the Super Coral Project. And the idea behind that project, which was led by a really charismatic scientist named Ruth Gates, who very tragically died a few years after I visited Hawaii, quite young. Anyway, the idea there was, well, we've really radically changed the oceans. We're pouring, tons of heat into the oceans via climate change. So the oceans are warming really rapidly, and we've also changed the chemistry of the oceans through the same mechanism. If you pour a lot of CO2 into the air, a lot of it ends up in the oceans very quickly, and it changes the chemistry of the oceans. And one group of organisms that really doesn't like that, we've seen that, doesn't like this effect, the combo effect, especially the heat, it seems, is corals, reef building corals. So reefs all around the world are suffering from what's called coral bleaching. We've lost something like half of the coral cover from the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, this is really, some serious shit. And but we're not getting the heat out of the water. That's just not happening. We're not getting the chemistry back in any sort of foreseeable human time frame. So the idea behind the Super Coral Project was, well, if we want reefs in the future, we've manipulated the oceans, we've manipulated the atmosphere and therefore the oceans, not consciously, unconsciously, just by burning a lot of fossil fuels. But if we want reefs, we're going to have to try to consciously manipulate corals. We're going to have to try to sort of breed up these corals that can withstand warming. And this sort of two levels of intervention. So first, you change the oceans, and then you try to change reefs because you don't like, the effects of the first intervention. That seemed to me to be opening up a new chapter in our, very complicated relationship to the natural world. And once I started to think about that, one form of manipulation overlaid on another form, I sort of started to see that pattern everywhere. And the ultimate expression of that is something that you've written about very eloquently, is solar geoengineering, and we can certainly talk about that. But the book sort of starts with reversing a river, which is a construction project that we can all kind of picture and see, and it was a massive project, but it's pretty easily comprehended, all the way through tinkering with the genetic makeup of organisms, through to manipulating the stratosphere because we don't like what we've done to the troposphere.
When you talk about the genetic engineering and manipulation of coral and the problems of the Great Barrier Reef, you also write about the great miracle of coral sex. This mysterious process. And I think you're the only person, except maybe Ken Caldera, that I know who's actually witnessed coral sex. So I think, can you explain what coral sex is like and what it's like to be a coral sex voyeur?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Coral sex is it's an orgiastic phenomenon. It only happens for a lot of species. There's no one way to have coral sex. How's that? But many species are hermaphroditic, and they release these what look like little beads, little glass beads, pink beads, once a year. They have what's called the mass spawning, and you can time it. Different species have slightly different. It seems to be light cues. When the water's a certain temperature, it always happens in what's our fall and what's the spring down in Australia, and after full moon. So you can be there. You can time your visit, hopefully, to correspond to a spawning. And what happens during the spawning is all of these, so corals are tiny little animals. They're also, not microscopic, but, this very, very small, very hard to even see with a naked eye. And when you're seeing a coral reef, you're seeing, a bazillion corals who are all connected to each other in this thin film of tissue. And they all of these polyps, they're called the individual polyps, they all release their little bundles or little beads at the same time. And so it looks like you're in a blizzard, except that it's moving up. The snow is moving up instead of down. And it's just fantastically beautiful. I mean, I think I quote someone in the piece, a scientist who was also there to watch the spawning, saying, this is really one of the great miracles of nature. And it's just breathtaking to see.
Yeah, it's really effective in the book because you really capture that, and then you capture this, humans laboring, trying to somehow play with and mimic this, and that complexity of natural systems is something that you sort of mine throughout the book, right? That's this idea of this sort of hubris that we all understand this, and I think that the place where that stakes are highest in that is the idea of solar engineering, right? And the idea of putting particles into the stratosphere and reflecting away a little bit of the sunlight. Talk a little bit about your, thoughts about that, and that's something that is, I've written about, others have written about, and has sort of gained traction over the years as it becomes clearer and clearer that whatever progress we may be making on emissions cutting, we're still moving into a time when climate impacts are enormous, and there may be calls for doing something quickly, and the politics of it are very complex. But what did you learn and think about when you kind of went into this world? You talked to people like David Keith and others at Harvard about this. What was the solar part of it like for you?
Well, as you say, I spent a lot of time at Harvard, where they have probably the biggest or best financed, has that solar geoengineering research. It's called the Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Program. It's a very fundamentally very creepy thing to think about. But the guys that I spoke to, three scientists mainly, also others, but the main sort of scientists on this project, David Keith, Frank Koich, also Dan Schrag. These are, really smart and thoughtful people. And they made a very compelling, case that we don't have a lot of, this gets back to the, point we were talking about earlier. We don't have a lot of arrows in our quiver to do something about climate change quickly. When we decide, okay, and so another thing that's important to recognize is we have not yet seen the full effects of the carbon dioxide that's up there now, right? So that's decades away. Meanwhile, we're still digging this hole. So at a certain point, and it may not be, it may be decades from now, it may not be that long from now. Decades are not, it's not that long. You decide, wow, we are committed to warming that humanity cannot deal with. That's going to cause tremendous suffering and mortality. And you can't reverse that. You can't stop it, except potentially, and I want to use the word potentially, very vigorously, by shooting some compound into the stratosphere that would block incoming sunlight, reflect sunlight back to space. That's what happens when you get a major volcanic eruption. They spew a lot of sulfur dioxide and it gets all the way into the stratosphere, it drifts around, it creates a sort of global haze that reflects sunlight back to Earth. And one of the many side effects that has is this sort of sky whitening effect. You get these fantastic sunsets and you get this sort of whitening effect. And that is the title of the book, Under a White Sky. But the idea is we'd create these sort of man-made volcanic eruptions. Without the eruption part, we would just shoot the stuff with a special fleet of airplanes directly into the stratosphere. And that could theoretically, once again, counteract the effects, or partially counteract it. You could calibrate it theoretically, of all the CO2 we've dumped into the atmosphere. And everyone who advocates this, I think, would say, or they would not say they're advocating it. They would say we need to look at it because we don't have a lot of great options at the point that we decide we've gone too far. Now, there's a huge debate. I mean, I'm already getting emails from scientists saying, we should not even be talking about this. It's the most dangerous possible thing to even be talking about. And I think that is, also a legitimate point. I think it's one of those debates where everyone has a legitimate point. And one of the, privileges, I suppose, of a journalist is to say, I don't get to decide whether this is going to be talked about. It is being talked about. How's that? And so I think I try to lay out, the possibilities and the, perils, which are, boundless.
So with the geoengineering and with a lot of, kind of theme running through your book is, it's not like we're talking about messing with pristine nature, right? It's not like our atmosphere is pristine, or humans have been mucking around on our planet for a long time, right? Obviously, and that's one of the things that you're writing about in your book, is that we've been trying to fix things, and now we got to fix what we've been trying to fix, and how that cascades on. And that is certainly true also with solar engineering, because we're dumping tons and tons of carbon dioxide and particulate matters and reflecting away sunlight and doing all kinds of things now. And you point out the well-known quote from Stuart Brand of is, we're already messing with nature. We may as well get good at it, or we're already acting as gods. We may as well kind of get good at it. And that's a complex argument, right? Because we are already messing with the, obviously with the climate, more specifically with the reflectivity of sunlight and all the things we're already in some sense geoengineering, right? So the question is, should we be thinking about doing a better job at it?
That is absolutely a key point. There's a strong impulse, and I share that impulse to say, well, let's just stop messing around. Let's just go back to the way, let's try to preserve things. And one of the sort of messages of the book, I think, or I hope it comes through in the book, or it came through to me, has that was, even preserving things today requires change. There's so much change has been set in motion. So, for example, while we might have thought of conservation, well, we're just going to, fence this off, humans stay out, let the natural world, do what it will, let's say. Now, with climate change superimposed on that, that's no longer a conservation strategy, right? Because everything's going to be moving, things are going to be moving in different directions. You're not preserving that ecosystem as it is just by fencing it off even. So that leads you, down this road or slippery slope or whatever you want to call it into, okay, well, what do we do now? And that, I think, is the moment that we're in. And it's not going to be a moment, it's going to be, a century or centuries of, okay, oh my God, someone described it. I read a description of my own book that was like, you broke it, you own it. We have manipulated this system. We didn't intend to in many cases. We didn't intend to warm up the planet, we didn't intend to acidify the oceans, but we did it. And then the question of, you can't just go back and say, oh, well, let's just leave it alone right now and maybe it will all be okay. We know that's not the case. So what are we going to do?
You never quite say this, at least I don't feel like you say this explicitly as a writer, but the implication I'm left with reading your book is that, of course, we're going to fuck it up in ways that we can't even begin to understand how we're going to fuck it up, right? I think the thing that comes away from your book is the amazing ingenuity and imagination humans have to think about solutions, right? And there's a lot of hope in a sense in that, but there's also this undercurrent of hubris through everything that we've done in this area, and that we are of course going to repeat that again, and we're going to imagine solutions that end up causing bigger problems than we know, right?
I mean, the book in some ways is a third way, in a way. Like there's this huge argument, in environmental circles between, the so-called eco-modernists, or like, let's just put up a bunch of nuclear plants and and if we got to geoengineer, we're going to find a way and everything's going to be great. And the Anthropocene's going to, the good Anthropocene is going to all end, great, because we're such clever people. And look, we're all here and there are almost 8 billion of us. And so we're obviously smart enough to figure this out. And then there's another school of thought that's, absolutely horrified by that, and that wants to takes a much more traditional conservation, approach, sort of, John Muirian, let's say. And I emotionally want to say, and with, the Muirians, but when you look at it, neither is tenable. Neither one of them really gets to the situation at hand. And what I was sort of trying to do, what I am trying to do in the book, is sort of break through both of those conversations. So, on some level, that's setting yourself up for, disaster. But that was one of my hopes, that this conversation even is not addressing what's really going on.
You spent, I don't know, presumably a couple of years on this book. I mean, books take a long time, and there's always the way you imagine the world and think about the world as you're writing it, and then the world that it emerges into. And two things have happened presumably since you finished the book. Two big things. One is the COVID pandemic, which has changed everything about our lives, and made us think differently about science and about government and regulations and all kinds of things. And also, we have the Biden administration, which has, in the last few weeks, taken some dramatic action on climate. I wonder how you feel about where the world is right now vis-a-vis your book versus how you felt about the world when you finished your book a year ago or whatever.
Well, I didn't finish it a year
Well,
ago.
whatever, 6 months ago or whatever.
It was kind of, but COVID really, I mean, I talk a little bit about COVID, which really, cut across the book, absolutely. Um, and really, I think, unfortunately, fits all too well with sort of the thematics of the book. It's, what I sort of talk about, man-made natural disasters, these coupled human and natural systems that are called, CHANs. That's an actual, term out there in the world, and it's used to refer to things like the Mississippi Delta, which is, hugely manipulated by humans. We control the flow of the Mississippi and with huge waterworks, et cetera. But you could apply it to the whole world as a coupled human and natural system. And you know, COVID, which presumably originated, with some either wild or domesticated animal, was absolutely a product of how we treat, the natural world, and then was spread immediately by the way we live now. The globalization of life. So it's definitely a coupled, human and natural system. We let it get completely out of control. We did not do, the things that scientists told us we should have done to control it, the outbreak, immediately. But we have now let it rage on, so that now we're getting new variants that are going to undermine, the vaccines that we've created. And we are hoping for the techno fix that's going to get us out of this. And as you suggested, we are also doing all the things to undermine the techno fix, as I say. So, we're gonna find, it's called vaccine escape. We're going to find that this virus is going to escape the vaccine. We're going to have a new vaccine. So it absolutely fits the pattern. So on that level, I would say, wow, this just confirmed my worst fears. The Biden administration, I want to applaud the administration. They have put together a great team. They have made major moves already. I think that's great and very encouraging. But I think it's important that we acknowledge how much, we have taken the first baby steps along a very, very, very long road. And whether we're going to, take one baby step forward and one baby step backward, the way we've been doing for the last, few decades. One administration comes in, puts in a reg, the next one comes in, lifts the reg. It's been just a disaster. We don't know the answer to that yet. Let us hope for the best, but let us also acknowledge that it's a very long and difficult process to decarbonize the economy. And, we have to do it. We know we have to do it, but we seem unable to just do it.